when are we unintentionally reaffirming gender expectations and binaries through performative acts related to CS education? So for example, if you listen to the interview with Sarah Judd, which I'll include a link to in the show notes, Sarah talks about how in the computer science classes that they're in school, in the K-12 setting, had these notions of what it meant to be a female in CS. It had these preconceived notions of what it meant to be a female or woman in computer science education, interested in it. So it came with assumptions like, oh, well, if you identify as a girl, then you like to help people and you like to have things with rainbows and ponies in it. And you don't like to talk about nerdy things like Star Wars, etc. So depending on how we set up our classroom environment and the ways that we communicate with the students that we work with and the assumptions that we make in terms of, oh, you are blank gender identity, therefore you must like blah, blah, blah. Those assumptions can reaffirm gender expectations and binaries through the performative acts that we are doing while teaching. So it's something to consider not only in relation to gender, but other identities as well. To use some verbiage from some academic discourse, we are essentializing or engaging in a process of cultural essentialization, where we are taking an identity and saying, you are X identity, therefore you must think Y and Z, without actually getting to know children as individuals. So the next question that I have is, how do we balance between finding solidarity within a marginalized identity and challenging the social construction of that identity? So here's a quote that is from page 530. Quote, "Certainly, it remains politically important to represent women, but to do that in a way that does not distort and reify the very collectivity the theory is supposed to emancipate." End quote. So in other words, yes, it's important to organize and find solidarity within marginalized identities. However, we have to understand that it is not a unified identity, and we should in some way try and challenge the construction or apparent unification of that identity. So an example that a professor used in a class that I took was going through a process of centering, decentering, and recentering. So one way to describe this might be to center around a particular identity. So, for example, myself getting to know and understand my perspective as a non-binary individual and finding others who identify similarly with their gender identity. Decentering might be trying to find other identities, perspectives, ways of being that exist outside of my own, to try and better understand many different perspectives and voices around gender. Recentering is then the process of coming back to myself and going, now that I've learned all these other things, how do I better understand, or how have my own identity around gender changed through this process of centering, decentering, and recentering? So one way we can do this in CS education is to potentially create personalized projects that get to know individuals. So for example, an interactive collage in Scratch. You could create this as a process of centering, where you are creating a collage that expresses who you are in that moment. You could then go through a series of projects that decenter around other identities outside of that collage. So if you identify as somebody who likes sports and somebody who likes painting and somebody who likes to read, you could then try and find some different perspectives or hobbies or identities or whatever outside of that and learn about it and create some projects around that. That would be a decentering process. Then a recentering process or project might be coming back and saying, okay, how can I take this new understanding, new ways of being that I now better understand, and reassess my own identity? And you engage in this process in a cyclical nature. So you're constantly centering, decentering, recentering. Now, I will say as a student, at the time I was a grad student, when I went through this process, many of these students in that particular class felt it was unstabilizing going through this process and difficult because it was constantly going, well, I thought I had this solid understanding of who I am as an individual, and now I'm realizing that one, there may have been some problematic assumptions that I was making, and two, that identity is not as firm as I thought it was. It's actually fluid and ever-changing, etc. So just a heads up in advance, if you as an individual, or the classes that you work with, decide to go through this process of centering, decentering, recentering, it can be a little unnerving or destabilizing going through this process of examining your identities. But it is a very worthwhile process, in my opinion. All right, so the final question that I have for this particular paper has an embedded quote in it from page 527. So if, quote, gender reality is performative, which means, quite simply, that it is real only to the extent that it is performed, end quote, what other identities besides gender might we consider as performative and in need of discussing as a field? So sticking with gender, if gender is a construction socially, and it is something that is performed, how can we challenge the notion of that construction and dive deeper in CS research, education, policy, discourse, etc.? But what other identities might be performative in nature and that we as a field need to discuss? Thankfully, as a field, we're starting to discuss race more. We're starting to discuss individuals with disabilities, whether physical, neurological, etc. But what other identities are potentially performative and that we should be discussing as a field? And I'm not saying we shouldn't discuss the things that we already are. We certainly need to do that. It's a yes and approach that I think that we as a field need to kind of figure out. The point is, who is missing from this conversation? What identities are we not discussing as a field? And how can we engage in a reflective process, similar to what I discussed in the Pedagogy of the Oppressed miniseries, where we are trying to examine from lenses oppressor and oppressed to figure out who's missing from this conversation and how are they being impacted by this. This excerpt of the CSK8 podcast is from episode number 72, which is titled Performative Acts and Gender Constitution, an essay in phenomenology and feminist theory.